Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, at the EU level, the refugee issue is not one that can be painted over in red or any other colour. The European Commission is grappling with how to handle the huge numbers arriving. The Dublin regulation in principle means that the thousands arriving each day on European shores are the problems of Greece and Italy, the countries where they arrive. That hasn't worked, but nor has the ambition to share people around. David Grossman reports.
This is one of Europe's few growth industries, hundreds of miles of razor wire going up across the continent. The Dutch, who took over the presidency of the EU Council, have made asylum and migration reform their first priority.
The current numbers are not sustainable. We are running out of time. We need a sharp reduction in the number of refugees in the coming 6 to 8 weeks.
The current rules were based on ones agreed in 1990. They state that the first EU country that an asylum seeker arrives in is responsible for them. But there's little incentive for those arrival countries like Greece and Italy to cooperate. Better to let the asylum seekers pass swiftly through to their preferred destinations in Northern Europe. Britain has an opt-out from migration and home affairs matters, but opted in to the Dublin regulations because it helps us. For example, it allows us to say that those in Calais have no right to claim asylum here in the UK.
We are very concerned by the noises coming out of the Commission about changes to the Dublin Agreement. We will want to engage to make sure that any changes protect Britain's interests.
Angela Merkel, in effect, suspended the Dublin rules last year when she told would-be asylum seekers that if they could get to Germany, they would not be sent back to their country of entry. More than 1 million took up the invitation, but the scale of that influx, as well as events in Cologne over New Year, mean that many in Germany now want an urgent reduction to those numbers. Today, the German president, supposedly above day-to-day politics, added his voice.
At some point, as problematic and as tragic as it may be, we will not be able to take in everyone.
It's one thing to agree that the system is broken, another to agree what should replace it. Increasingly, though, countries are going it alone, bringing in their own systems outside the EU. Austria today announced it would cap the number allowed to claim asylum at 37,500 a year. That's less than half the 90,000 who claimed asylum in the last 12 months. But what happens to people once that limit is reached? Some sort of unspecified distribution around Europe.
Wir können in Österreich nicht alle.
Austria cannot accommodate all asylum seekers, announced the Chancellor today. The country on Austria's southern border, Slovenia, says it will now bring in a limit as well, pushing the problem back over its southern border into Croatia. Further south still, Macedonia today closed its border with Greece to migrants. The so-called Balkan route to northern Europe is seizing up fast. Also in trouble then is the Schengen Agreement that allows borderless travel between 22 of the 28 EU members.
I think Europe would be much better if we ended the Schengen arrangements, had internal border controls, but also countries offering sanctuary to those who've been assessed as refugees.
But the European Commission wouldn't abandon Schengen without a fight. The Commission's president, Jean-Claude Juncker, made that very clear today. Getting rid of Schengen, he told the Parliament in Strasbourg, will hurt the single market. And without a single market, the day will come when we ask, do we really need a single currency and the free movement of workers? In March, EU leaders will meet for a special summit to find a solution. Whatever they decide, it seems they'll be ordering more of this.
Some big stakes there. David Grossman reporting. It so happens a lot of policymakers and business people are holed up this week in the Swiss resort town of Davos for the World Economic Forum. You saw the German president there. One person among them is Kofi Annan, who used to be the Secretary General of the UN. He was also an envoy to Syria in 2012, although didn't get far in trying his attempts to sort that out. I spoke to him earlier today about Syria, but first about Europe's response to the refugee crisis.
I think it's been difficult for Europe
And it's unfortunate that it's also dividing Europe. We all have responsibility to assist refugees. They have rights, and the countries in the region have done a lot. Some European countries have tried to do better than others, but of course they are coming under tremendous pressure at home. I also believe that the mainstream leaders have not been outspoken. They should have started earlier on explaining to the public what it is all about. Why is it that these refugees are coming and what needed to be done? By not doing so, they allowed the extremist and the right-wing parties to take the issue in a completely different direction, and now they are playing defense and catch up.
I don't know what you think of the British approach, which has been to say, we don't want to take people who've landed in Europe, we want to help people back in or around Syria itself. I don't know, is that a better approach, or is that a more heartless approach?
That was the usual approach. When we had the Vietnamese crisis, the boat people's crisis, that was the way it was handled. You screened them on the ground. If US wanted 20,000, you flew them out. If US or UK wanted 5,000, you flew them to UK. It wasn't a situation of people walking across and coming across the border in the way it has happened in Europe recently. And I think attempts are being made to get back to that effective, smooth handling of refugee cases.
And just to be clear, I'm guessing you support the European Commission, which is trying to look again at the so-called Dublin Convention, which says the first country in which they arrive is the one that has to handle them, which really means Greece and Italy have hundreds of thousands of people who they're responsible for, and they're meant to be responsible for on their own. Is that dead as far as you can see?
Well, that is a requirement, that is a law, but there comes a time when an exception also has to be made. The situation is such that one cannot leave Greece and Italy alone to bear the brunt.
Just look ahead. 1 decade, 3 decades, 5 decades. Is this migration issue going to become more and more acute for the world? And do we have, I don't know, what you might call governance arrangements of any kind for handling it as a global issue?
The movement of people will continue, and if we are not able to handle the climate crisis properly, we will see more people on the move. But we do not have the laws and the rules to tackle that kind of movement. And so there is urgency for the international community to look at the way it handles movements of people, which is going to really be on the increase.
Right. Well, look, of course, one of the proximate immediate causes of migration is the Syrian civil war. You were an envoy back in 2012. I wonder whether you've got hopes for the talks that are meant to be starting in Geneva next week. At the moment, I don't think we even are quite sure who's going to be there. Is there some progress that's been made since you were trying to sort it out those years ago?
I think I'm confident that the US and Russia will have effective cooperation. I have confidence in Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov, and I think they will work effectively with the other powers. The difficulty will be getting the regional powers to cooperate, and I think we've seen the situation in the region become much more complicated. We need to see Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey working effectively with the permanent members of the Council, and today we are not there yet. And those who have influence on the fighters on the ground, either on the Syrian government side or the side of the rebels, have to bring their influence to bear and press them to go to the table.
ISIS, of course, is a new factor in Syria. It wasn't there when you were around in 2012. Do you think it's possible to talk to ISIS? I mean, a phrase that's been used as a route through to ISIS in terms of communication. Is that possible, do you think?
I don't see them at the table. I don't think they would be invited, nor would they want to go. On the other hand, you cannot defeat them through military means alone. And so there are other political measures which will have to be taken, and some concessions which will have to be made by governments in the region. And I think we need to also work with the Iraqi government to ensure that they treat all their constituents, all their citizens even-handedly. Today, the Sunnis feel that they are not fairly treated, and the Shia dominate, and there is a tendency that quite a lot of them have sympathy, or originally they did have sympathy for ISIS. We need to pull them away from that support.
I just wonder what you make of the fate of humankind at the moment. There have been people who've been very optimistic and who say the world is becoming less violent and more empathetic. We understand our fellow human beings better than we did in medieval times or 2,000 years ago. When you look at that conflict, what conclusion do you draw about our species and its capacity for cruelty?
I've been appalled by some of the violence and the brutality we've seen in the Syrian situation. But I don't think it's all hopeless. We shouldn't forget the 30-year war in Europe. It took the European countries to realize that was a senseless war where nobody wins, and they came together and had their they had their moment at the Peace of Westphalia. And I hope that would also happen in Syria. People will wake up. The governments have to understand it's a common danger. It's engulfing us all. The brutality, as you referred to, is not now limited to the region. It's spreading around the world. So it's difficult, it's tough, but it's not hopeless. It's not hopeless. The world has seen this before, and terrorists have risen up time and again, but they've always been defeated.
Kofi Annan, thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you.